Hello, and welcome to The Last Story. I'm Noelle, and I'm joined by my co-host Darla. In today's episode, Darla and I are going to talk a bit about our personal artist manifestos. Specifically, we're going to be answering questions relating to if we could only tell one more story.
Thanks for that introduction. So, since the name of this podcast is The Last Story, I think we should get right down to it and tell you our stories. That one special story that each of us would choose if it was the very last story we got to tell as writers. Why don't you go first, Noelle? What story would you tell and why that story?
Oh geez, that's a heavy one. This is the question that plagues me every time I open a new document or turn to a new page in my notebook. As a creative nonfiction writer, I guess more than anything, I want to tell my story. That might seem like a cop-out, but it's true. And I want this story to be honest. During my undergrad, I wrote a 40-page memoir relating to mental health, with very real events and emotions, but it was based on one big lie.
Well, you know what Neil Gaiman says about that, don't you? He says, "We who make stories know that we tell lies for a living, but they are good lies that say true things." So Noelle, go ahead with your true things.
If I could only tell one more story, I'd like to redo that memoir. I'd like to make it a braided memoir and incorporate into it some of my gymnastics stories and chronic illness trials in addition to the mental health aspect of things. I would want to tell this story because it highlights so many of the communities that I'm a part of. The disabled community, the chronically ill community, the gymnastics community. A lot of negative stigma surrounds each of these communities, and I think my story would bring a much needed light. While there are some negative experiences and emotional turmoil at times, I would like my story to show the good from those communities.
You know, Noelle, I think that bringing much needed light to issues that are important to us has to be the most important criteria for what you choose as your last story. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I agree. In one of my creative writing classes, my professor mentioned that each of us have one story inside of us that is just yearning to be written. I guess this is mine. How about you, Darla? If you could only tell one more story, what story would you tell? And why that story?
I've been working on a novel for quite some time. It's my thesis project, and I am damn determined that I'm going to finish it. Here's the first line of my elevator pitch. Set in a stunningly beautiful but eerily empty western United States, this is a post-apocalyptic tale of hope and courage. So that's the macro, the broader picture of the last story I would tell if I could only tell one. To go micro, I would tell the story of Isabel, one of the three protagonists.
Ooh, that's an interesting proposal. I hope to be able to hear the whole story one day. But if you had to tell just one story, why do you think you'd choose to tell Isabel's?
Well, Isabel is an older woman. She's a few years older than me, so mid to late 60s. See, the thing is, we live in a society where youth is revered above all else. Above wisdom, above experience, above fully formed amygdalas. There's this activist that I know of, Ashton Applewhite, and she calls ageism the last prejudice to bubble to the surface of our consciousness. And she's right. So if I only get to tell one more story, I want to tell the story of an older woman who's a badass.
That's great. There are so many people who get overlooked in society, from those with disabilities to those who are simply older. That's the intersection I see between our two stories. How do you think our stories relate?
Well, we're both talking about changing the world by giving voice and power to underheard and maligned communities. That's one thing.
You're right. Everybody deserves to have a voice, no matter what hand they've been dealt in this crazy game of life.
So let's go deeper, Noelle. We know which stories we would choose and why, but what do you think you would lose if you never told your braided memoir story?
In keeping in the vein of truth, I think I would lose a sense of self if I couldn't tell that braided story. So much energy went into crafting my 40-page memoir that I now called the false memoir. All of the emotion that went into that piece was real, though, and it was a very raw piece. Writing allows me to explore myself more, and without that, I'd just kind of be a bit of a mess and unsure of my direction. Writing this story would allow me to find myself on the page and finally put different puzzle pieces together in order to arrive at myself as a final product.
That is definitely relatable. And what do you think the world would lose if you never told your story?
I think I briefly began to touch on what the world would gain from this story while answering the first question of the episode. They would gain a better understanding of the disabled community, the chronically ill community, and the gymnastics community. Without this story, I think the world would continue to idolize gymnastics, despite the nefariousness taking place behind the scenes. I also think the world would look down on the disabled and chronically ill communities, and continue to equate the words disabled and chronically ill with a negative connotation. If I tell my story the right way, I hope to erase those connotations. I want the world to see that you can be sick and still thrive. Our path to thriving has oh so many setbacks, but our lives can be just as fruitful as those who are able-bodied and not chronically ill.
Well, it certainly seems like the world needs to hear this story.
Now, Darla, what about you? What do you think you would lose if you never got to tell Isabel's story?
What would I lose personally? Wow, that is complicated. So my dad was a cabinet maker, incredibly talented. And I spent the first 30 years of my adult life following in his footsteps. I was a costume and clothing designer. I designed and built booths and movie sets. I remodeled a house or two. It was all about making, just like my dad. Fast forward to a few years ago, and I was no longer making, not in the physical hammer, nails, paintbrush sort of way, but I was writing, which is something my mom always wanted to do but didn't.
It's interesting that you took after your dad in regard to making things. Did your mom ever write creatively?
Well, yeah. She had a bachelor's in English and she taught before she met my dad. After she died, I found a short story of hers and it was good. It was really good. But she gave up those kinds of dreams in order to be a wife and a mother, just like most women in the 50s and 60s.
So, are you doing this for your mom then?
Nope, I am doing this for me. My mom and I didn't exactly get along. She was a fun woman. She was vivacious. She was so adventurous. But she was also a hard woman, and she was especially hard on me. So fast forward. There I was in the few weeks between earning my BA and starting grad school, and I realized that I was following in my mother's footsteps, and I got the worst case of writer's block ever. I was petrified at the idea of competing with the ghost of my mom over a talent we both had. So what I think I would lose by not telling this story is that I would never get to finally make peace with my dead mom. I would never get to fully claim the good things I got from her, and I would never get to fully heal the hurts. I would never get to stand up and say, not yell, but say, no, Mom, this is my story, and I'm going to tell it my way.
That's a very tender answer. You don't want to forget where you came from, but you do have to pave your own paths and write the stories you want to tell. Shifting a bit, what do you think the world would lose if you never told that story?
Oh, well, that's a much easier question to answer. The world would continue slipping into the trap that says old people are worthless. And face it, it's not just the US anymore. We've exported our disregard for elders all across the globe. Even nations that traditionally respect their elderly have swallowed our youth obsession like their morning beverage. And women, young women, would lose someone telling them not to worry, that they won't lose their significance with each new wrinkle. Old women? Old women would lose having a righteous, badass old broad reminding them of their value, reminding them that they don't shed power as they age, but rather they gain it. They would lose that voice telling them that they bring to the table wisdom and experience and the ability to work together, to learn together, and to hold each other up. They would lose the voice telling them, "You got this, old lady. You got this."
I think you make a good final point, Darla. Older women do have wisdom and plenty to teach and pass on to the younger generations. Relating back to both of our stories and their significance in the world, it's important to remember that every voice matters, and you shouldn't count somebody out because of their abilities or lack thereof, or their age. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of The Last Story. Be sure to join us next week when we talk about incorporating real-life experiences into fiction-based stories. And as always, thanks for listening.